Hello, my name is Ella Rooms, and I serve as the Programs and Digital Content Coordinator here at the Dole Institute. I'm also a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members have access to exciting opportunities through their involvement with the Institute. This includes volunteering for evening programs and networking with our special guests. If you are a student and would like to join, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending today's program, presented by the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. After the program, we will have time for audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Sean Kalick, the Director of the Department of Military History.
Thank you. Appreciate it. I have the pleasure today of introducing Dr. Jonathan Abel, who is an associate professor in the Department of Military History at CGSC. Dr. Abel is our H100 block author, which is fantastic. He's also a product of the University of North Texas and writes extensively on the 18th and early 19th century, specifically Guibert. So you are in for a great treat, and without further ado, Dr. Abel.
So today what we're going to talk about is how you do innovation in militaries, particularly innovation around a piece of technology, and how that's not always as simple as it appears. One of the things we often do, particularly in military history, is we kind of sand off the rough edges and false starts of innovation, and we make it this very simplistic morality play of the technology appears, the military figures out how to use it, and then they start winning wars. What we're going to talk about today is a case study in that, in a technology that appears and takes over a century to mature. Because there are a lot of different steps along the road from fielding a new technology to being very good with it. And that piece of technology is the musket. This is the place where we're going to be. We're going to spend this hour in 18th and early 19th century linear warfare. Now, this painting is a little bit of an exaggeration. I'll explain it when we get there again. This is a Prussian army in the War of Austrian Succession. But this is the kind of warfare we're talking about. And there you see the Prussian soldiers carrying the piece of technology we're going to be talking about, the musket. So this is the weapon system. This is the weapon system that dominated warfare from around 1700 until, let's call it 1880. And that is the musket. So a musket is kind of a general term for the weapon system. Specifically, most of the ones that we're going to be talking about are smoothbore weapons, so it's inappropriate to call them rifles, that are about 4.5 feet long. And the thing that makes it a weapon system is you add the bayonet to the end of it. In this case, a socket bayonet that locks on with a collar and doesn't block you from firing. That's one of the great innovations right around 1700. That makes the whole thing about 6 feet long. And the reason you need the musket with the bayonet is it gives you a weapon system that lets you defend against both enemy infantry and enemy cavalry. Because shooting at enemy cavalry doesn't do much, but if you could stab the horses, you have a way to defend yourself against them. So this appears in the form that you see it more or less around 1700. The smoothbore musket, it's about 70 caliber, give or take. The balls were cast by soldiers, so they're never that accurate. With the socket bayonet. It's first officially approved in France right around 1700. It's fully fielded by the end of that decade. France is fighting a big war that decade, the War of the Spanish Succession. And it will dominate the battlefields until the advent of the rifled musket, which takes over in the 1860s and 1870s. Same weapon, it's just the rifling makes it more accurate over longer ranges. And then eventually we're going to get breech loaders, and I see several of you shaking your head. So Don't need to elaborate on that. Now, there's an ancillary to the weapon system, and that is developments in artillery. Now, artillery has not changed substantially. We've had field artillery for a few centuries by this point, but what is changing in France in the 18th century is we're developing a new kind of artillery. There's this big fight between big, heavy guns, it's called the Valliere system, and lighter guns under what is known as the Gribeval system. Gribeval wanted lighter guns because they would be more mobile, because they could be used in offensive warfare, as opposed to Valliere guns, which you just park outside a siege and shoot them at the siege works until the garrison surrendered. What Gribeval will do is essentially for artillery what the musket did for infantry. He will provide a standardized system that becomes the paradigm that everyone will then adopt. This is the origin of Napoleonic artillery. Those of you aware how important artillery was to Napoleon. We're largely going to focus on the musket, but a lot of what we talk about is more or less a one-to-one analogy to the artillery as well. Notice cavalry is not pictured. Cavalry, still, long swords, stabby. Not much has changed there. So this is the way that early modern armies fought before the advent of the weapon system we're talking about. These are two paintings separated by almost 200 years. And they accurately depict the way warfare was from about 1450 until the 18th century. In this case, the Habsburg-Valois Wars on the left and the Spanish Succession on the right. What you see there is a relatively chaotic battlefield. You have units that are discrete. You could see, particularly in the painting on the left, you could see the infantry, cavalry, and artillery units, and they're not really interacting with each other. They're kind of fighting their own battles in this very, as the French would say, the very petty tactical level. And that continues for about 200 years, as you can see. These units are proprietary. They are owned by their commanders, for the most part. That means that there is no standardization. There's no standardization of equipment, of practices, of weapons, of tactics. So armies, prior to 1700, for the most part, are assemblies of units that don't necessarily have a lot in common with each other. There are exceptions to that, but that's generally the rule. Here's a great example, one of the great artworks from the early modern period. This is during the 30 Years' War. This is the Battle of Breitenfeld, one of Gustav Adolf's battles. There you see the classic early modern pike and shot formation. So you could see the pikes surrounded by those are probably arquebusiers with some early muskets. Again, a very chaotic, disconnected battlefield. You can put these pike and shot formations next to each other. If you're familiar with the Spanish tercio, that's more or less how they worked. But they don't really interact with each other. They more or less fight their own battles within sight of each other. Now, you can win wars that way. Plenty of people did in those 2 centuries. But it's not necessarily going to give you a connected, holistic way of war. It's not going to allow you to leverage the resources that your state might have. This is where we're headed, and the Prussians are kind of an exaggeration. The Prussians of Friedrich II, you see up there in the top, always looks kind of surprised in that painting. Now, this is an exaggeration. Alex Burns out there is watching somewhere, and he will castigate me for putting this painting up. At no point in the 18th century did an army deploy like that in a 3-deep line that would be like 40,000 men wide. But you get the idea. Notice what's changed. We no longer have the disconnected block formations that might just happen to be in the same space. Now we have an army that is standardized across the ranks and files. Something has changed between Blenheim in 1704 and these battles in the 1740s. And a lot of that has to do with the musket. Okay, so what's the problem? Why can't we just bring in this new technological system, this new weapon system, implement it, and then go? Well, it's not that easy. It's never that easy with technology, despite the way that we often make it to be. Once the musket is adopted, pretty much universally around 1700, these two problems appear. And you've got a quote from an 18th century military theorist about each of them. The first is that the musket increases lethality over greater ranges compared to prior weapon systems and tactics. This is the same problem, those of you who are familiar with the US Civil War, this is the same problem the rifled musket causes. Just a slightly more primitive version of it. And as this theorist, Guibert, notes, this gives the primacy, the initiative to the defense. In the end, today, the system of modern wars more than ever turned to the defense. The predominance of the defense in the system of modern war draws from the type of our current weapons, which are more favorable to the defense than to the attack. That was written in the 1770s. That may sound vaguely familiar to some of you because it's very similar to Clausewitz's much later statement that defense is the stronger form of war. The problem of the musket is it's really easy to lay down a curtain of fire and to stop offensive action that way. It doesn't have to be in volleys. The idea that armies of the time fired volleys is largely a myth. But you have to be able to fire enough to stop an offense coming at you, which, as a practitioner of the time said, was relatively easy to do. So that's problem one. Muskets make defense stronger than offense, and offense wins wars. Problem two is how you then conduct an offense given the primacy of defense that the musket gives you. And there you see the movements that formed an army in column or in battle order being so lengthy and so complicated required entire hours to make a general disposition. It required taking the order of battle quite far from the enemy, and once this order was formed, one did not dare to hazard changes in it for fear of overwhelming it. Imagine a line, even let's make it a contemporary line, of 20,000 men wide. So this is a relatively small army for the 18th century, on 3 ranks, so 60,000 men. How do you maneuver that? How do you command and control a line of men 20,000 men wide, 20,000 meters wide? The math is a man takes up about a meter of space. And then, how do you move it forward? Because we got to attack somebody, right? That's how you win wars. This is the core of the problem. This is easy to defend it. You tell the men to stand where they are and shoot at the enemy. But how do you attack it? If you do it with cavalry, they'll get shredded. If you slowly walk your infantry up, they will also get shredded. And of course, the other thing that's happening, as we mentioned, is artillery is increasing in range and lethality as well. So what Guibert tells us about the musket is that it has increased the things you want armies to do well. Kill the enemy fast and at a further range from you. The problem is that makes it harder for you to win your wars. The solution to this problem, or to these two problems, as I mentioned, takes over a century. And there's a whole series of steps involved in it, starting at the very beginning of the century and moving through. In this case, we're talking about how France does this. There are other models for doing this. There's a Prussian model. There's a Russian model that people still debate. But what we're talking about is how the French did it today. So they start as early as the 1750s. They look at what the Prussians are doing and saying, okay, we can do some of that. Not all of it, because we don't want to be Prussian. We'll do some of it. We're going to start with reforming from the very bottom levels. One of the reasons why we kind of compress transformation into these morality plays is we often don't want to step through the complicated and often detailed and thus boring steps that are necessary for transformation to make this new weapon system work for offensive warfare, for decisive warfare. That's what a lot of those first bullet points are, and we'll walk through each of these individually. We also need to create a superior leader. Despite the way Americans think about war, it tends to be kind of techno-futurist. It's technologically, it's platform dependent. Leadership and individual people still matter. In order to command and control a linear warfare formation in battle, in the fog and friction of early modern battle, You have to have leaders who know what they're doing and who can coordinate with their leaders to the left and right of them, and sometimes forward of them. That's going to take a higher standard than whoever happens to have a noble title gets to command. So we're going to start doing some of that in the middle of the century as well. We then have to take those basic reforms that we're going to talk about and do them at higher levels. We need more than just disconnected battalions on a battlefield. We need to be able to bring those together in higher echelon formations. And those of you who know where this is headed, you can see the date there. This is combined arms divisions and then corps. And then finally, we have to make the army practice this, because an army that doesn't practice is an army that's not very good when it comes to war. And notice where we are now. We're now firmly in the Napoleonic period. So again, over a century. Let's talk about some of these, the people who were behind these. There are 5 key people in France who oversee these reforms. The first of them is a really interesting figure. The grandson of the disgraced financier, Nicolas Fouquet, who Louis XIV had put in jail, is a man named Belle-Île. He is more or less the central figure in the French army in the early half of the 18th century. He's the one who looks at the Prussians before anybody else is and says, let's take some of that. He is Minister of War up until his death in the 1860s, so he's masterminding the war effort in the 7 Years' War, which is not necessarily a point in his credit, but still. That's what the Secretary of State for War Minister. Choiseul is his successor. Choiseul is the major reformer. He's the Enlightenment figure. He's the one who shepherds the encyclopedia to publication, among others, if you're familiar with the encyclopedia during the Age of Enlightenment. When he comes in, this is when we start to see major reforms. So Belle-Île helps lay the foundation. Choiseul is going to be the one who really changes the direction of the French army. And you might notice, not accidentally, this is after the defeat in the 7 Years' War. Defeat is usually a great instigator for change. One of the field commanders in the 7 Years' War, one of the few good commanders, was Marshal Broglie. He is kind of the senior soldier in the French army through the Revolution. And he's going to be one of the people who's out in the field implementing these reforms. And he will implement a key reform in the war on his own initiative that later becomes one of these bedrock reforms. And then the theorist we already met, Guibert, who's one of the people who writes about a lot of this in the 1770s. And then he's in charge of some of the reforms in the 70s and then again in the late 1780s. Okay, that's 4 people during this period. The 5th is Napoleon. Napoleon is the one who will put the cap on all of this. He's the one who's going to take the reforms and drive them to victory, at least until he starts losing. So those are the key players in the French reform process that we're talking about. The first step is one that seems so incredibly stupid to modern people, it's often easy to miss how important it is. Remember I said that early modern units were owned by their commanders? If you were a colonel, you bought your regiment. If you were a captain, you bought your company. And then it was your job to man it, to equip it, to staff it, and to see to its training. As you can imagine, that means there's no uniformity of anything. So one of the big reforms that happens between the 1750s and 1770s is the government comes in and says, no, these units will be standardized. They will no longer be owned by their commanders. The government's going to tell you how many men are in a battalion or a squadron. It's going to tell you how many officers, how much they get paid. So now the government is establishing a baseline of standardization. So now we can get away from those disconnected blocks that we saw in the pre-1700 paintings. Now, units, at least on paper, are going to be interchangeable for each other. You can pull a battalion out of one place and plug it in another place, and that battalion's going to look like the battalion it replaced. And you're looking here at an example of what a battalion would have looked like at the time. These are giant battalions. These are 1,000-man battalions. This is one of the steps in the process. So we're laying the foundation for how this works. Now, every infantry and cavalry unit's going to have the same training, the same manning, the same structure, and in theory, as I said, will be plug and play. We're not going to achieve that reality until the revolution, but at least the groundwork has been laid, the administrative groundwork, which also means the government is now responsible for running the units instead of their owners. That's another big change that takes place here. Okay, now that we have standardization of units, how do they act on the battlefield? One of the next tasks then is to put them next to each other and teach them how to act when they have a unit that looks like them on either flank instead of just, well, go figure it out. And that's what they do all throughout the time period of the 1770s and 1780s. I mentioned Broglie was one of the people who's important. Broglie is the garrison commander at Metz. It's the most important fortress on the frontier. It's on the German frontier. Broglie takes units every year in September, because that's when the weather's best, and he marches them around the fields outside the garrison, doing things like this. This is how you go from a standardization program on paper to an army of standardized units that acts like an army, holistically. Now, these are still relatively low level. If you did an exercise like this, you might have a quarter of the troops that are depicted. But the principles are what we're laying down. Once you have the standardization of units and training and equipping and all of that, then you can work on standardization of practice. You could take your drill from the battalion level up to the army level. And here you get an example of how that might work. One of the core problems of linear warfare, as we mentioned, was command and control. How do you move these blocks around? Because if you just let men march forward, they're going to bunch up together and you're going to lose your lines. So as the quote at the beginning said, the way that they used to do it, that's what's labeled old tactics, kind of in the bigger upper left, it's really slow. These are not small formations. The line of units, in this case they're chasseurs, but it could be any unit, that might be 20,000 men. There's an infamous example of a battle fought in 1757, the Battle of Rosbach. The French and their imperial allies agreed to attack the Prussians before dawn. They were in position to attack the Prussians 2 p.m. because it took that long to do this, and you see how you need to move. Imagine how far that unit has to go along that arc. Or, as you could see in the upper right, if you're marching on those obliques, by the time the last unit gets into place, that first unit has been sitting there for a while. You can't do any better than that with units that are not standardized. That's why the standardization is so important. But once you standardize them, then you can start doing the kinds of things that are in the lower right. Notice how much simpler it is to put a unit in the middle of the line and deploy around it, than put the first one up and then do that long arc march or the oblique marches. This is much simpler. And another barrier they had to overcome was that unit on the top, the one that's kind of doesn't really have anywhere to go, that's the oldest unit. It's the most prestigious. Therefore, it has to march the least long route. They finally got over that in the 1770s when they realized this whole prestige thing is kind of helping us lose battles. So instead of the most prestigious unit being the one you deploy off of, now it's the most convenient one. That's another mindset change that has to take place. And these are the kinds of things that they're doing in those practices that Broglie is commanding. This is what it looks like on a larger scale. This is an army-size exercise. Now, they do not often bring an entire army out in the field to exercise with it because it's really expensive. It costs a whole lot of money to exercise an army, but you can't be a good army unless you exercise as an army. It's kind of a catch-22. They do in 1778. That date might ring a bell for some of you because that is in the lead up to France joining the War of American Independence. They put a field army in Normandy And while they're waiting to get across the channel, they of course never do, they decide that they may as well try some of this stuff. This is the most important exercise of the 18th century at a place called Vaucieux. Now you can line up an army of 40,000 men and walk them through these exercises. Now we're no longer marching around in a square as a battalion or even as a regiment. Now we could take an entire army and put it through those same paces. And we could teach people what works and what doesn't work. They also have exercises where they fight each other. So they break into two armies and they fight each other with different systems to see which ones work. One of those army commanders was Rochambeau, who's going to be the one who goes to America. And he proves that he's a very good army commander. He's very fast, he's very dexterous with these units. So we're doing a lot of very mundane things in these decades, but they're very important things. We're standardizing the units, and we're making them work, and we're making the officers work them. Because when you exercise like this, you're training the officers too. It's not just about getting the men to march around. It's about getting officers to understand, how do I get a unit to where I need it to? How do I work together with the officer who's next to me? Now, those officers don't come out of nowhere. The way the French have done it up to this point is command goes to the nobility. That's more or less true across the board. About 10% of officers are commoners. They're almost always lieutenants. And they're almost always 30-year service captains who get promoted to lieutenant more or less as a sinecure. There are no generals who are commoners, at least not in France in the 18th century. That's worked for a long time, but it's not really working for them anymore. One of the things the French realized earlier than almost anybody, to their credit, is that you cannot just rely on natural talent to bring good commanders, especially below the general officer level. You're always gonna spawn general officers in a military, but the junior level leaders, the junior officers, kind of the mid-grade officers, what we would call field grade officers, those don't come from nowhere. And France really has a deficit of those, as you can imagine, with all these blocks, with the standardization of linear warfare. That's a much more technical form of war. So you need an officer who is trained in the technical aspects of warfare. So France is going to create the first modern professional education system for its military in the 1750s. They had prior schools, they had technical schools like for the artillery. But in 1750, France creates the first professional military education school, the École Royale Militaire, which still exists. It's still in Paris. There you see it on the bottom left. To train its officers, to give them a basic education, which was not all that common at the time. Nobles' education could be kind of spotty. It was what they could afford. They got rid of all of the noble stuff like how to dance and replaced it with things like ballistics and languages too, because chances are you're going to fight in a multinational army, maybe you need to know German or even English. They started teaching you English at one point. So that way you have a cadre of officers who are educated and trained on how to do this stuff, and then they go out in the field and then they actually do it. This system produced the officers that drove Napoleon's armies to victory, including, of course, Napoleon himself, who went to one of these schools. I do what I do because of this system. Myself and my colleagues who are here, we work in a school that is modeled off of this model. That's the easy stuff, believe it or not. To make this a truly new or even revolutionary system of war, we have to take it further than the tactical level, because we've kind of been playing around at the tactical level up till now. We have to be able to standardize at a level higher than the battalion. The battalion is the core tactical unit of a French army. The Prussians have a leap on this. The Prussians have higher echelon formations like brigades and divisions. Now, the French have used brigades and divisions as well, but not as permanent formations. They're ad hoc, essentially task forces that they task to do something, and then the unit goes away. The role of brigadier in the French army is actually not a rank. You were not a brigadier by rank, you were a brigadier by job. So you could be a lieutenant colonel brigadier. Yet that just meant that you commanded a brigade. What we're going to do, starting in 1759, is we're going to do things differently. And the man who does it is Broglie. Broglie takes command of the largest French army in the 7 Years' War in 1759, and he orders it divided into divisions. Combined arms, not all arms yet, combined arms combat divisions, which means they're also using brigades. So now we're going to take the standardization that we've been working on, and we're going to continue to work on, at the lower levels of tactics, and we're going to take it up to the higher levels of tactics, and maybe even touch on operations a little bit. Now, this map is kind of a mess. It's what contemporary maps look like. I colorized it so it's actually kind of easier to see. But this tells you what Broglie is doing. This is at that camp I talked about earlier at Valsieux. Broglie is one of the few French commanders of the period who understands the operational level of war. He understands that you can't just do tactics at scale with a field army, which almost all of his predecessors had done, victoriously or not. He understands that in order to win war in the age of linear warfare, you have to articulate your force at the operational level. Now, he's not there yet. This is still very tactical. But you see how he's operating differently from that painting. We have our line of troops, right, that looks like the painting, but look what they do once they start maneuvering. They're maneuvering by section instead of just taking a line and slowly marching it forward, which is the way they normally did things. He has articulated his force into brigades and divisions in a way that makes them much more mobile and therefore much more useful. Again, he's not there yet. Notice at the end of the exercise outside of St. Croix there, they're still in a line. He's still thinking in linear warfare. But he's helping lay the groundwork for what's coming. This is why he's the premier soldier of the era, because he thinks further than his contemporaries. Not much further, but a little bit. Let's fast forward to the Revolution, where we start to see this really pay off. So all of these revolutionary commanders and officers, as we mentioned, had been trained in the Royal Army. Many of them had been NCOs or junior officers. They rise to command positions. In this case, the French commander, Jourdan, had been in the Royal Army and then risen to general rank. What we see here is we're beginning to pay off what Broglie was doing. By 1794, the French army is very good. It's been fighting for 3 years against a coalition of enemies. It's burned off the chaff. It has the levée en masse feeding it manpower and resources. It's commanded by people who are educated, skilled, loyal revolutionaries, at least for now. And what it's doing is it's doing the more of what Broglie started to do in that exercise in the last slide. This is not an army fighting in a line. This is an army articulated into combat divisions. These divisions are semi-autonomous units that can fight next to each other without getting run over by the enemy, but can plug into the greater plan for the battle and for the campaign. This is where we really start to see the operational level of war emerge, as we articulate the force beyond the line of the old regime, now that we've gotten out of the old regime. It doesn't hurt that we've gotten rid of nobility, so the best men can rise to command instead of the men who were born to it. And you see there the example, you see all of the divisions that Jourdan deploys at the Battle of Fleurus in 1794. My friend and colleague Jordan Hayworth would argue that these are proto-corps. I will not quite go that far, but you can kind of squint and see it. Although, the savvy among you might notice, the Austrians are doing the same thing. So the French don't have a jump on anybody. Everybody's kind of doing things the same way. All right, this is what we've been building towards. It took until Napoleon to really put all of these different pieces together. And it's going to take until Napoleon has the only period of peace in his reign. So Napoleon takes command of France in 1799. He will reign until 1814 with a coda. The only period where he is not at war during that 15-year period is these years, basically 1802 to 1805. During that time, he's going to bring his army to the North Sea coast, to the Channel coast, and he's going to deploy it in a whole series of camps. We call it Bologna because that's the main one, but there's a whole series of camps all along the coast. And what his predecessors like Broglie had done, he's going to do at a much larger scale. He's going to take all of the ingredients that had kind of been stirred up in the old regime and revolution, and he's going to forge them into an army. And he's going to forge them into an army that is capable of fighting truly operational level warfare. For one, he has the time to do it. So we talked about how Broglie spent the time at Valsieux. It was a month where he had the army exercise and then fight each other in mock battles. Napoleon's going to spend 18 months doing that. This is where he's going to build his core. The combined arms, in most cases all arms unit that is the foundational element of his army. So he takes that combined arms division idea and bumps it up an echelon into the operational level space. And what that will give us is an army that could do the things that his predecessors never could. So on the left of this core, you have the stuff you'd expect to find in a combined arms formation. You get a lot of infantry, a fair amount of cavalry, actually, artillery, and then you could peek inside the division and see what it has as well. It's the stuff on the right that makes the core matter. Because the stuff on the left is a standard formation. Whether it's a formal corps d'armée, whether it's a task force, people have been doing that for centuries. The stuff on the right is what makes the corps special. It has organic medical, Napoleon, inventor of battlefield medicine. But it's the communication and movement capabilities that the corps has that makes it work. You have bridging, the kind of sideways E, those are engineers, because you need to build roads and bridges to move your corps. You can't wait for those things to come up from the rear. That's why you have all the transport, that spoked wheel, those are transport units. And you have the modern symbol is the signal, looks like the lightning bolt. You have to have runners, carrier pigeon, shap telegraph to communicate across the army so you can coordinate the movement of these units as they move through the operational environment. So this is what Napoleon is building at Bologna. He's building them, he's giving skilled commanders, his marshals, command of them, and he's having them practice in the same kinds of exercises that Broglie did, individually, but also force on force, to winnow out the chaff. Again, for 18 months. Those of you who maybe have spent time in service, imagine spending 18 months at NTC. The weather's a little better at Bologna, but still. This is what he does with them. This is the 1805 campaign. This is kind of the apotheosis of what we have been building to. This is not linear warfare anymore. It is at the tactical level. The tactics, by and large, have not changed. They're being commanded by people who are good at them, so they look more dynamic, but a company commander, a captain from 1705 would recognize the tactics of 1805. What he would not recognize is what's happening on this map. This is Napoleon's army divided into corps. In this particular war, the army down there at the very bottom, at the German city of Ulm, it's commanded by a general named Mack, even though it's labeled Ferdinand. Mack is the de facto commander. They have taken the offensive, marched down the Danube, daring Napoleon to attack them, and dug in at Ulm. Napoleon comes boiling out of northern France with all these different corps. Notice that they're not on the same line. We have broken the line of linear warfare at the operational level because we don't need it anymore. We could take these corps and have them march on different roads. We call it distributed maneuver. And that will enable us to maneuver not on Ulm. Notice they're not aiming for Ulm. What Napoleon did here is instead of going straight at the enemy army, he went behind it. And once he cut the Danube, Mack was stuck. And in fact, he ends up surrendering without a major battle. The other 4 men did not imagine that this was possible. The predecessors to Napoleon, Belle-Isle, Choiseul, Broglie, Guibert, they helped build the elements of this, but Napoleon is the one who really puts it together and understands beyond the tactical level. All of this happened because Louis XIV made a decision in 1700 to equip his men with muskets with socket bayonets. This is the eventual perfection of the kind of warfare waged with that weapon system. But it takes a lot of different steps to get there. You could not do this in 1710. You couldn't do this in 1760. You had to step through each process. There were no shortcuts. And of course, Napoleon's enemies will catch on to this. They'll start doing it, and instead of having corps running over enemy divisions, now you have corps meeting each other, and we're back to stalemate. We call that stalemate World War I. An example of how this works at the tactical level. I like to tell students if they did this for a tactics competition, they would lose. Notice what Napoleon's done here. He's bunched all of his stuff up at the top. He's got essentially 5 corps on his left, 1 corps on his right. Notice what the key terrain is held by. Basically a series of companies pushed forward of regimental headquarters. What, of course, he is doing is he is suckering the Russians into attacking his apparently weak right. Because one of the things that makes this whole system work is the fact that this unit can march, what's the number, 80 kilometers in 30 hours straight into the battle, which his opponents absolutely could not do. And of course, this is his masterpiece. But it wouldn't have been possible without his predecessors, without the people who built the foundations, the guts of each of these units. So what do we take away from this? What do we take away from this study in technological and organizational innovation? As I said, we have this story that we tell ourselves in military history often. You're probably familiar with a version of it, whether it's the Panzer tank or Billy Mitchell and air power, or pick a technological advance and the war in which it was fielded. That you have on the one hand the technology that is obviously superior and the future, and a prophet, a Billy Mitchell, who says that it's what we need to do. And on the other hand, you have these old, backwards, conservative recidivists who fight the prophet because reasons. What that story ignores is that transformation is far more complicated and requires many more steps than simply pointing at a piece of technology and saying, yes, that will immediately go into our military. And what we've talked about is many of the steps that were necessary to do that. Technology does not automatically make militaries better. In fact, in some cases, technology can make militaries worse. Because a lot of times the technology doesn't do what you need it to do. Technology fresh off the production line doesn't always work the way militaries need it to, especially when it gets muddy. That's a big problem. So technology, despite what our American techno-futurist brains often think, technology is not always automatically better than what we're doing now. New technology cannot simply be shoved into an existing military. You have to incorporate it into the way that the military does things. Militaries, at least for now, are made of humans. And humans do not always automatically accept new things in the ways that are best for them or for the new thing. You have to take that into account when you engage in transformation, particularly transformation based on technology. As we learned from this case study, you can't simply break the line of linear warfare, because then you produce chaos and you get a lot of people killed. The musket eventually allowed you to do that, but you had to incorporate it. You had to indoctrinate it across generations of French soldiers for it to work, to go from musket to Napoleonic operational warfare. A corollary to that is technology is often best incorporated in a military when it's accompanied with effective theory, doctrine, and practice. You have to see how the technology is going to be used and then incorporate it and field it according to the ways that militaries do things. You can't just hand it to them and say, go do this in a way that's completely different from the way you did things. If you get that process right, that can be truly revolutionary. I think, looking at Dr. Kalick, who's one of our nuclear experts, I think the nuclear weapon is an exception to this, but pretty much every other piece of technology needs to be accompanied by theory, doctrine, and practice. And then finally, we have to acknowledge that transformation takes time. You cannot snap your fingers and make large organizations change themselves radically, no matter how much you might want to. Those old, stodgy conservatives in the morality play of change, they often have good reasons for saying, we can't do this change immediately the way you want it right now. There are often reasons you can't do that. There are often reasons that involve production. There are often reasons that involve the people who are fielding these pieces of equipment. But there are many other reasons as well, and we tend to forget. Sometimes technologies don't end up actually working. You try them, they don't work, and you abandon them. Tank destroyer in World War II, great example. Never did what it was supposed to do, even though we spent a whole lot of money on them. And as I said, we have to remember that militaries are manned by humans. They are not robots. They don't do what you want automatically the way you want all the time. You have to take into account that they have their own beliefs and prejudices and practices, and just because those are against a particular technology or change doesn't mean they're wrong. We're back to the existing theory, doctrine, practice, ways of doing things. You have to marry the two. You can't have one override the other. And so what we saw in the example of the French in the 18th century is they had to overcome all these barriers very slowly. No person, even their grandson, lived to see the process from beginning to end. The fielding of the musket with socket bayonet to Napoleonic operational warfare. Essentially 5 generations between them. Change takes time. All right. Questions? Tom? We'll wait on the mic. The mic is being run. Well, we need it for the YouTube audience.
Oh, wonderful. What service. Okay. All right. You described Broly in 1759 as organizing his army into divisions. And then you describe Jourdan in 1794 again organizing his army into divisions. My question really is about the delta between those two things. Mm-hmm. When Broly organizes his divisions, is it the same, sort of the same logic and rationale? Is it the same composition? Or is Broly's conceptualization still different from Jourdan's?
So I would say it is similar, but not identical. And to elaborate on that, again, as I mentioned in the exercise, Broly still thought the old way. He still thought in terms of linear warfare. His divisions were about getting to the battle, and then he would line them up in the big ponderous line, and they would slowly march. He didn't really think of them as being truly articulated. It was more a thing he was doing for march, as opposed to campaigning and then fighting. Also, these are ad hoc units. So he's putting them together based on what's pushed to him by the Secretary of State for War back in France. Jourdan's divisions are legal. They're created by the government, and the government determines what goes into them. By 1794, we have formal brigades and formal divisions. And the bridge between them is the document you see there on the right. That's the actual archival document from France. 1788, they create the first formal divisions in the French army. They're tests. They're a hybrid of a territorial and a combat division, and they're the stepping stone into the formal division of the revolution. And people like Jourdan understood what articulated warfare looked like. They weren't quite to the core yet, although, as I said, my friend and colleague Jordan Hayworth argues they were, but they're getting there. And Tom, I see you nodding because I knew you knew the answer to that. Thank you for the question. Other questions? We just had two French historians talk to each other. Tom, again.
Since we seem to have an available moment here, let me ask the obvious question that I'm sure is on everyone's minds, which is, what the heck does Napoleon have to do with this? Does he really have anything original to contribute, or is he just kind of mechanically going forward with the inherited wisdom of the officer corps?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's one that's often mistaken by people who don't spend a lot of time studying Napoleon. The assumption is that Napoleon was the one who did everything, that everything kind of fell out of his brain and it was radically different from everything that preceded him. That's very much not true. Napoleon had everything up to the division built for him, which makes sense, right? Napoleon's an army commander. Army commanders don't busy themselves with the minor tactics of how a battalion fights. There's a great line in Jomini where he says a regiment should almost always fight the same way, which is the way Napoleon approached it. The tactical commanders deal with the tactics. The exception to that was artillery because he was a fires officer. But by and large, he's not messing with the tactics. He's not messing with the manning system. What he's messing with is the upper levels of it. He's the one who puts the field army, we would say maybe the theater level, changes in place. The corps was Napoleon's creation. The general staff, this is not a Prussian general staff, it works differently, but Napoleon's general staff is his creation based on predecessors. And a lot of the details of, I mentioned the medical system, things like that, the enablers, as opposed to that left side of the corps diagram that's the combat arms. He was more dealing with the stuff on the right side and the echelons that have more X's than just the three. But yeah, another good question. Sir, wait for the mic.
As important as this stuff was in the 1700s to 1805, why in 2025 is the Command and General Staff College cutting back on force management instruction, which handles all your doctrine, organization, training, leadership? Why?
I absolutely do not have an answer to that. I am a history instructor. We want to talk about force management history, we can, but.
I just want to also say that this is kind of important because since about 1979, we really haven't fielded a major ground combat system. You know, the M10 Booker, which was a light tank, was a tank. It got cut. And, you know, we need to do more of this and get more officers trained in that, because I don't think we're doing as well as we should.
Well, I can only speak for my students, but they are well trained in Napoleonic force management. I believe you had a question, sir? Right here.
Towards the end of this era, after the French Revolution, when Austria and Prussia invaded France, and France's response was to start the first modern draft, the levy en masse, how would you say that affected all of this development of tactics in the French army, this massive increase in the size of armies in about the 1790s or so?
Yeah, very good question. So there's two stages to the conscription system of the 1790s. There's, as you mentioned, the levy en masse in August of 1793. That mobilized the French people for the war effort. What follows, we often forget, in 1798 is called the Jourdan Law, which established a yearly conscription system that brought people in every year, whether France was at peace or war. That's the modern conscription system. It both did and didn't affect it. So the tactics didn't change. The organization didn't change. What they had to figure out was how to take large numbers of unskilled conscripts who were not going to be lifers, at least in theory, although many of them ended up being so, and how to get them into the war fast. Because in 1793, you are at war. This is not an academic question. There are enemy armies in your territory. So what they have to figure out is, how do we take a small, well-trained professional royal army that's still hanging around, and all of these conscripts, up to 700,000 of them, and marry them together? And what they do is, it's called the amalgam. Basically, they take the old Royal Army soldiers and make them the new commanders, junior officers, NCOs, and then they plug the conscripts in as the manpower that they're then going to train. And so once that gets regularized in 1798, then they start doing the kind of indoctrination practices that people are more familiar with in modern armies. So you bring those conscripts in the winter, you train them in like how to hold a musket and all that, and then come spring, you put them in a depot battalion, and if war comes, the depot battalion stays home while the other two battalions go fight, and then the depot battalion will be ready at the end of that year. So then you start to regularize it. So you have the emergency version in 1793, and then the regular version in 1798. But it's not changing the way war is fought. It's just changing the input. And the U.S. Army military does the same thing in World War II, where you have a cadre army that you then build the conscripts into once conscription starts and before the war. It's a very good question. Any other questions? Tom?
You described this period of amazing ferment, 1757, 1759, going up to 1805, maybe a little later than that. Mm-hmm. The question is, do you have creative ferment like this after 1815, or does it all kind of level off and become dormant after that?
No, so there's an incredible ferment that continues in the French army basically through the end of the century. I would argue it stops right around 1917 because they all die. But before that, there is an incredible intellectual environment in the French army. And I will say this both to the audience here and the audience online. If anybody wants a research project, to my knowledge, nobody has looked at the Army's official journal. It's called the Military Spectator. It's founded by Napoleonic veterans in the 1820s, and it runs until 1914. And in that journal, they talk about all of this stuff in exhaustive detail. They talk about new things that are happening. They talk about kind of the Bugeaud method in the colonies, where you take light infantry and marry them up with light artillery. They move really fast across the deserts of Algeria, that kind of stuff, how that might play in warfare on the continent. They're talking about all of this, both in person and in exercises and in these journals, in a way that they hadn't before. That's one of the pieces that was missing from the 18th century, which is why progress happens more rapidly in the 19th century. That, and by the end of the century, most people are literate. So that helps as well. So yeah, it absolutely continues, which makes sense if you've got a whole, probably hundreds of thousands of Napoleonic veterans who want to talk about their experiences. And many of them live a long time. Marshal Soult is the war minister in, 1851? And he destroyed the archives, took out everything bad about himself. So a lot of these guys live a long time. Jomini dies in 1869. he has a good sense to die before France gets crushed by Prussia. So yeah, it absolutely continues. And to my knowledge, the studies of that period are fragmentary, at least in English. There's plenty of work for researchers if they want a project. All right, thank you all for coming. See you guys next month.